Hey patrons, welcome back to the second part of this tutorial series. In the first part we were focusing on getting a base layer down for this owl. As you can see, we applied the base layer with some quite cheap colour pencils and we've blended it out with solvent. And now I'm going to go ahead and build up our second layer, which is really to darken everything up, define things a bit more, and also to add more detail. So the first thing that I'm going to be doing is going back in with the black pencil, which is the pencil that we started off with at the start of this drawing. And I'm going to go ahead and darken everything up that needs to be darkened up with the black pencil. So for example, the pupil around the eyes and the black feathers and the beak, all of the areas that are black for this owl, I'm just adding another layer of the black pencil too. And now this is going to be the final layer in this drawing. I'm not going to be using too much solvent. I'll be using it a bit in a few places as I go, but I'm not going to be going over the whole of the owl with another layer of solvent, so you can apply a bit more pressure now, really to get it as dark as it needs to be. Now on screen it may not look really dark because of the fact that there's a little bit of shine the way the camera is, but you'll see when I tilt it right at the end of this drawing and also at the start, you can see that it was very jet black. Just with colour pencil there can be a bit of shine. So for these areas I do want it to be jet black, so I am applying quite a bit of pressure to really get as much pigment down into the tooth of the paper as possible. And you can see that my pencil is really nice and sharp, and that is important because we are trying to get nice defined edges and details with this layer, so you don't want to have any blunt pencils. So I'm starting off by really darkening up the eyes and the really dark feathers by the eyes. It should be easier to do the second layer because you are just adding the same sort of colours, just adding another layer of them. So we've already got everything established, which does make it a little bit easier because it's just about darkening it up even more. I also will be adding a lot more feather texture in this particular part of the series because at the moment all of the colours are established and we've got the general anatomy down of the bird, but there isn't too much detail to the feathers yet. They look quite sort of flat and there's not really much of a feather texture there, so we will be doing that a bit more in a minute. So I am just blending over that layer with a little bit of solvent just to darken it up even more. And also it helps to get rid of some of the shine. As I mentioned in the previous part, this whole sort of section is quite shadowed, so I'm adding quite a lot of black in this area. All of the feathers from like the eye to the beak, that sort of area, are quite dark. So I'm also starting to create a few little details. As you can see, a few little lines there because the feathers in this area are quite thin, so I'm doing a lot of lines to give a nice feather texture. And I'm just going over and applying another layer of the black pencil to the whole of the beak. And this just gives a really nice smooth layer because once you've gone in with the solvent it can be a bit patchy in areas, so this just helps to really give a nice smooth jet black layer to the whole of the beak. And the pencil goes so nicely over the top of the previous layer as well, which it wouldn't have done if you didn't blend with the solvent. Darkening up that little bit by the other eye. And adding a few details to the left of the beak. Always look at the reference still and look at the direction of the feathers, especially as you're starting to add more details with this layer. It's important to keep looking at the direction the feathers are going in. For example, in this particular area they're curving down. So you can see I'm doing my pencil strokes with a nice curving downwards to match with the reference image. Now, in order to make a drawing look really realistic, you need to have a good contrast. So that is why it's really important to go in and add additional layers and not just call it finished. Go in and really darken up your shadows and brighten up your highlights, which we will be doing in a minute once we've gone in and added all of the darker areas with the black. We'll be going in with the white pencil and pulling up even more of the highlights because that's just as important. I'm also darkening up the black feathers on the head of the bird, and as you can see, these particular feathers are curving upwards, curving up around the shape of the head. So as you can see, they go in different directions for different areas of the body of the owl. So even though you've got a base layer down already, it's still important to just check back in with your reference and see where the details are. And I do draw feathers very similarly to how I draw fur. So I do them in the same sort of way, which as you can see, I'm building it up with a series of lines, not just loads of random lines. Also, as I mentioned in a previous part, the feather shapes can be different and there's different types of feathers. So make sure you're looking at your reference and identifying what type of feather it is that you're meant to be drawing. Look at how they layer on top of each other, how big, how wide are the feathers. Are they smooth or are they really fluffy? Are they like really silky? Are they laid flat or do they puff up a little bit? For example, to the left of the beak, you can see those feathers are quite fluffy and puffed up, whereas on the body, they're laying quite flat to the bird. So it's important to look at how the feathers are laying in each particular area as well. So I'm also adding some details just above the eye, and I tend to add details to break up these solid areas of black that I've shaded in, because if you leave them just as they are, it's not going to look very realistic because they're just like shapes of black at the moment. So it's important to go in and add some details and add a bit of texture by creating these lines as well. These little pencil strokes that help to soften and break it up rather than it just looking like a shape that you've coloured in black. I'm still jumping around quite a bit. As I notice something, I will switch areas. You can see already the areas that I've darkened up and started adding details to, it already looks more realistic than it did before. More striking, it has more contrast. I'm going to darken up the feathers for the larger feathers for like the ear area. There's quite a lot of shadow in those feathers. Even if I'm trying to shade in a large area, I still try to do strokes, still try to look for the direction those feathers are going in and do the lines accordingly to that direction. So I'm just going to go throughout the bird and repeat this process for the next few minutes. So make sure you're just adding another layer to all of the darker shadows. For example, we need to really darken up that black area of feathers just above the eye and to the side on the left hand side of the face of the bird, that strip of black feathers that is sort of dividing the face of the bird from the body, and also more on the ears and on the top of the head. So I'm going to continue to do this, continue to make sure your pencil is nice and sharp as you do this. And as always, keep looking at how the feathers are laying with each of the body parts. Are they puffed up? Are they lying flat? Are they small? Or are they thick feathers? How are they curving around each body part? So yeah, carry on and I will be back to talk you through the next part, but this part is going to take quite a while to do this. There's not really much else I can say about this particular part because I've kind of already explained it to you a bit in the first part, and it really is just time consuming. It's basically what I've been doing for the last sort of 10-15 minutes. It's just doing it throughout the whole of the bird, which does take time, but there's nothing really new to the technique. It's just about applying that process throughout the whole of the animal, which really does take a bit of time, but don't rush it. It's really important that you guys don't rush what you're doing. So yeah, I'll be back to talk you through the next step in a little bit. So I'm still working on the same part, but I thought I would just talk you through this little section here because as you can see, I am trying to integrate the black feathers more into the feathers to the right of them, because if I was to just shade this all in, like I said in part 1, it's going to look like just an outline section of feathers, whereas I want it to look like the feathers are transitioning more into each other. So you will see that I do some strokes with my pencil that go further into those lighter feathers next to them, like I'm doing now. I don't stop it at the same point or just go back and forth and shade in this whole area. I'm trying to integrate it more into the sections of feathers next to them. So it's not only important to darken it up, but also to make it look natural, like it's feathers, like they are sections of feathers that transition and overlap onto each other. So it's important that you overlap some of the black feathers over onto the lighter feathers, or just make it look like the lighter feathers are overlapping onto the darker ones, which is achieved by going in slightly further with some of the black pencil strokes into the lighter feathers, and then also, you know, not going as far in so it looks like the white feathers are over the top of the black areas. So that's just a little trick that's so important for making your feathers look really natural and really realistic with quite an easy technique. And I will be doing that process for every single section of the black feathers. I even do it a little bit for those tiny feathers, for example the black feathers on the top of the head. You can see that with each of the sections I've got some pencil strokes that are going further into the lighter areas. You can see that I have some longer strokes of black with each of the little black feathers to help integrate it into those lighter areas next to it. But I am also just shading in the whole area as well, just to darken it all up. So once again, I'm just going to continue to repeat this process throughout the whole of the owl. I just thought I would talk you through that little bit because that is really important. With the body of the owl, I do want it to look slightly softer, so I will be going over it with solvent and my brush because I want it to look more out of focus. Even though in the reference it's not particularly out of focus, that's what I want to do with mine so that it has more depth, because the face of the bird will be more of the focal point. And I do really want to darken up the body of the bird as well, because on that left hand side of the bird, it is a lot more shadowed. So the first thing that I'm doing is going in with my black pencil and just going around all of these feathers. And the feathers for the body are larger, they're more curvy, they're more like, I don't know how to explain it, but they're not such spiky feathers. They're more silky, they're laid more flat, and they're bigger and more curvy at the bottom. But even within the body, there are still some little black feathers. So there's still a variety of sizes and even shapes as well. But don't worry too much about creating lots of detail on the left-hand side of the body of the bird, because I am going to make it look a little more softer. So you don't need to create loads of detail if you want to try and soften it out and give it more of an out of focus look. The key to making something more out of focus is to include less detail. And the key to making something the focal point is to, apply and add more detail to it. So once again, I'm just going to continue, and there's not too much left to do with the black pencil. I'm just getting in the final areas, darkening them up a little bit more. Going back over to the body. So I'm moving back over to the face of the bird within that lighter area. Now I'm just adding a few little details. This area has got a few of those little black feathers going across it, really thin feathers, so I'm doing lines to represent them. Thin pencil strokes. But this is pretty much it for this stage. I am going to spend a few more minutes just tweaking things and adjusting things. I recommend that you guys look at your reference image and look at your drawing and just make sure you're happy with how dark everything is, and see whether you're happy with make sure you've checked that you've got all of the feathers in that you need to and all of the details. Now I'm going to switch over to the grey pencil. And I'm going to use this to start to darken up the eye. So I'm happy that I've got in all of the dark shadows for the feathers, but I want to darken up the eye even more. I feel like it could do with a bit more depth. So I'm going in with the grey pencil, and I'm focusing that on all of the areas that we initially applied the shadowed colours to. So mainly on the upper half of the iris where the cast shadow is going to be. So the feathers on top of the eye is going to be casting and preventing as much light from getting to the top of the iris. So we've got a shadow there, and also directly around the pupil, and also directly around the bottom of the iris as well, mainly around the outside edges of the iris, and then it's a little bit lighter in the middle. So I was just using the grey, and now I'm going in with the brown. I'm just going to layer a little bit of brown over that as well to give it more of a natural colour, make it a bit more vibrant rather than being so dull. And I'm also adding a tiny bit of black just to darken it up even further right at the top where it's in the most shadow. As you can see, I'm also doing lines as I'm doing this, as well as sometimes going in circular motions. But when I do lines, you can see that I'm curving it with the curvature of the iris. And when I blend it out as well, I'm also going with the sort of shape of the iris as well. Briefly going back in with the grey pencil. Now I'm going to go in with the tan pencil. This is more of an orangey tone. And I'm just going to go over all of the shadowed areas with this. And I'm going to go in with the yellow and just add a layer of this all over those lighter areas. And also to help transition into those shadows a bit more. So you can see I'm adding some strokes going up into the shadowed areas as well. Just going over the pupil once more, and you can see as I apply that pencil, you can see a little bit of the shine. I also want to go in with the white pencil and just add a tiny bit of highlight, and you can see that I'm targeting the highlight right in the center of that iris and going around the shape of the iris as well. I'm also going to glaze some yellow over that as well, so it's not so washed out. Adding the yellow over the top of the white makes it look really vibrant. I'm also adding a little bit of white to the waterline to make that pop as well and brighten that up. And I'm going to start now to use the white pencil to add in more details for the feathers, add in more feather texture, and also to add in a lot more highlight as well. So you can use this to brighten up certain areas, or as you can see, I'm using it to really go and get in more of a feather texture to make it look like there's more layers of the feathers. As you can see, my pencil's really sharp. I am pressing quite hard because I do want this to show up. So you can see I'm adding a few little rogue feathers going over the top of the black areas, and this helps again to tie each section in together to make it look like they are feathers on the same animal. There needs to be some sort of transition there. So that's why I'm adding a few little feathers flicking up and overlapping on top of the black layers of feathers as well. To sort of connect them, I'm adding little feathers going over the top of the iris and the pupil a little bit. It's this attention to detail that is so important. So you can see how I'm adding just little lines over the black sections of feathers, and this really does help to transition between these areas now. And I'm also going to go throughout the head of the bird and just work a little bit of the white pencil throughout all of the black sections of feathers on the head. Just work the white pencil in between these, just adding a few pencil strokes between each of the black feathers to again highlight those lighter areas, brighten up some of those areas, and also transition from the light areas into the black feathers. Just to add a bit more texture there, because we've got the texture in for the black feathers, but we still only have a base layer for that lighter colour of feathers. So it's important that we go in with the white now and start to make it look like more of a feather texture rather than it just being flat and just a base layer of colour really. So you can see I am overlapping the white onto the black, onto the black feathers as well. You can see how well this white pencil sticks on top of that first layer of coloured pencil. Particularly this Caran d'Ache pencil, it works so well. So I'm adding some white feathers going over the top of the beak. Also brightening up around the beak as well. So now we've got this fluffy section of feathers. And there's a lot of white in between these black areas that we've already added in. So it's important that we're going with quite a lot of the white pencil here. Once again, I'm still jumping around between sections as I notice something that I need to change. Once again, this process isn't particularly difficult. It is just time consuming because you've got to go and repeat this process throughout every single section of the bird. But remember, for the more shadowed areas, for example on the left hand side of the body, we won't want to be adding too much white, because if you want an area to be shadowed, you don't want to add lots of highlights. This is either just to sort of add detail, add more texture, or to brighten up an area a lot. There are sections that we really do need to brighten up. For example, the feathers along the bottom. So for example, the feathers under the beak and slightly to the left. They are very bright. So I'm adding a few little white feathers going over the top of this black strip of feathers. And like when we had the black pencil, we were adding some lines with the pencil that are going further into the lighter section of feathers, which I said was really important. I'm also doing the same with the white, where I'm adding some pencil strokes with the white pencil that are going over onto the black feathers, so they really do mesh both ways in together as well. The feathers underneath the eye are very light, so I'm targeting a lot of the white pencil there. Just keep looking at the reference. For example, I noticed that within this section of black feathers there was a tiny bit of highlight, so I added a few little feathers with my white pencil within that black area of feathers. So you've got to pay attention to all of these little details in the reference. But once again, I'm going to continue to do this all the way around the owl, repeating the same process, the same technique. There's not much else to say. And so just keep watching what I'm doing, but more importantly, look at your drawing, because your needs for your drawing will be slightly different to mine. So evaluate your drawing and your reference. Don't feel like you have to copy me exactly. Use and learn from what I'm doing, but then apply that to your scenario, to your drawing. By the way, like I said, if I really want the white to show up, then press as hard as you can if you really want it to show up. But yeah, just carry on and I'll be back to talk you through the next step in a little bit. I am adding a few highlights within the body just to add a variety and more contrast, but I will be glazing brown over the whole of the left hand side of the body. So the white's not really going to stand out this much, but it's more just to give a variety in the tones of the feathers, so it's not all the same colour. But that's why I'm not adding loads of detail within the body, because like I keep mentioning, I want it to look more out of focus and softer, so that we're really drawn towards the face of the bird rather than all of the feathers. I want to target the viewer to looking more at the eyes and the face and all of the detail there. So I'm just going to give it more of a softer look and add more shadow to the body as well. So as you can see, we're nearly finished off with the white pencil. Everything's a lot brighter. We definitely have more contrast there now that we've gone in with the black pencil and darkened everything up and gone in with the white pencil and added more highlights. We are definitely getting there with the realism. There's a lot more detail there. We've definitely got a feather texture going on. It's not looking so flat anymore. And like I said, contrast, which is one of the most important things for getting a realistic drawing, is definitely better than it was for our base layer. So right now, as always, I'm just looking for those final things that I need to adjust. I'm just being very picky. But you could leave it here and move on to the next step. Like I said, the next step is going to be going in with your brown pencil. So the darker brown pencil, so like I said, we were using the light brown and the normal brown Crayola pencil. And I'm going to be using the normal brown pencil to really build up some shadow for not only the left hand side of the body of the bird, but also some other areas as well. So now I'm going to go in with that brown pencil. And first I'm targeting it on the body of the bird. I'm going over the black as well. So I'm applying the brown everywhere. I'm also looking at the reference to see which areas have more of a brown tone to them, because some areas of the reference, the feathers are more grey or lighter or more black, but there are sections of the reference where the feathers are more brown toned. As you can see, that's why I'm adding the brown now to these few areas within the reference that are more saturated, more of a brownish tone, rather than being really light or black or grey. They have more of a brown tone to them. So I'm just working that brown pencil for through the areas that I feel aren't quite brown enough, that need to be a bit darker and to have more of a brown tone to them. Also just to add more variety to the colour of the feathers. So I'm just also being a bit random and just dotting a little bit of brown throughout the feathers on the head of the bird, just to mix it up, just to add more variety to the tones of the feathers. I am going to be adding quite a lot to the ears and to the left hand side of the bird mainly, because that's where a lot of the shadow and the brown shadows are. I also just want to glaze more of this colour over the whole of the left hand side of the body, as I said before. Like I said, I wanted to glaze it over the white areas as well. So you can see I'm using the side of the pencil. I'm holding the pencil quite far back and I'm just going and shading the colour everywhere, all over those areas that I want to darken up. And I will be blending over that with the solvent as well. I'm just going to build up another layer. Just keep building it up nice and lightly until you're happy with how dark it is. If you want it to be darker but not so brown, you could add a little more grey or black to really darken it up. I really am trying to work the brown over the top of the black as well. And I am working little bits of brown throughout these lighter patches of feathers where there are more shadows to them. So for the slightly more shadowed parts of each section, even the lightest sections of feathers are going to have a few shadows to them. I'm just using the brown to get them in. And to add a few details, but like I said, I am really just going in with the brown a little bit randomly, just to add a bit more saturation to the owl. Feel like it's looking a bit dull at the moment, so I'm really just going in and adding it and warming up the owl a bit, just in a few key areas where there's more shadow. So I'm looking for areas that need to be darkened up, and instead of going in with greys and blacks, I'm just going in with a bit of brown to really warm up the owl. Once again, adding a bit more shading to the body of the bird. Now I'm going in with the black pencil and just darkening up some of those black feathers within the body even more. So we've added our brown layer all the way across the body, and now I'm going to go in with an extra layer of the black just to really darken up those feathers even further, because the whole point of this area is we want to darken it up a bit more. That's our aim for this layer, to really darken up this section. Really, I'm just adding more layers of pigments so that when we blend it out with the solvent, it will look even darker. Now I'm going in with not much solvent on the brush at all, and I'm just going over the whole of the body, and you can see that it's not only darkening it up, but it's also softening it up quite a lot as well. I'm not going over the whole of the body, just really on the left hand side where it's also more shadowed, and just actually blending through some more of those shadows as well on other areas of the owl, just to really darken them up and make them more intense. But you can see how the left hand side of the body now looks more shadowed and more blurry. It looks smoother, has more of a softer look to it, which gives the drawing a bit more depth as well. So I'm blending the shadows on the face of the owl, underneath the eye, to the side of the eye as well, blending out a little bit of shadow on the head, just anywhere that I want to get a bit darker. Just adding a few little details on top with the black pencil, darkening up areas as I go now. For the areas that I've blended out, some of them, I feel like when I've blended that out, it's got rid of some of the darkness, or it's not got rid of it, but it's spread it out more. So I'm going back in with the black pencil just to really intensify some of those shadows. So going back over to the body and darkening up some areas over there. Though I do recommend you wait a few minutes for the solvent to dry. It does dry fairly fast, especially when you only use the tiniest bit. But make sure you wait before you go in with the black pencil. Otherwise, if the paper is wet and vulnerable, then you could damage it, and you don't want to do that. So just give it a few minutes to completely dry before you work on top of it with more coloured pencil. Once again, it's also looking a little bit shiny from this angle with the lighting, so remember it is a lot more jet black when it's in the proper lighting, which you'll see at the end. Yeah, so now I'm just going to spend the next few minutes really just going in and darkening up any areas that I feel like I need to for the last time. Now that I'm nearly finished with this stage, I'm going to talk you through what I'm going to be doing next. So what I'm going to be doing is going through and adding in some brighter highlights throughout this owl painting, drawing, whatever you want to call it, with two products that I don't know how readily available they are in every country, but it is the Brush and Pencil Titanium White Powder and Touch Up Texture like liquid. And when you mix those two things together, it creates like a white paint-like consistency, which is archival to use on top of colored pencils, so it won't like wreck or damage your drawing at all, and it will still last over time. And you can apply it like paint it on, and it gives you really nice bright highlights. So like I said, I don't know how easy it is to get a hold of in every country. They might have made it more readily available, but if you can't get your hands on it, and if you're not worried about your painting not being archival or lasting for, you know, hundreds of years, well, even longer than a few years, then you could use like white paint or a white gel pen. But if you don't want your like painting to change over time, then I would recommend using something that's archival with colored pencils. I've used white gel pen in the past and haven't seen any real effect that much on the drawing. It's not like chipped off or anything. But if you are worried about anything like that and you're not just doing this for practice, if you're just doing this for practice and you're not worried about it, you just want to, you know, practice and experiment, then don't worry too much about everything being really archival. So I'm starting off with my clean palette, and here are the two products that I'm mixing together. We've got the powder, the titanium white powder, and our Touch Up Texture liquid. So I'm first going to start off by giving the bottle a good shake. Mix all of that liquid together. It does say to shake well, so that is what I'm doing. I'm just making sure the well in my palette is nice and clean. And I'm just going to put a few drops of this into the well of my palette. So you don't need too much. I'm just going to pour a tiny bit in. There we go. So now that we have the Touch Up Texture liquid in, I now need to add the powder to it and mix them together to create that paint-like consistency. At the moment, that's just a clear liquid. So I'm just going to unscrew my titanium white powder and just pour a little bit of that in, not too much. About that much will do. And now I need to mix these two together, so I'm just going to get a paintbrush. And I'm going to be using a really small detailed brush to paint these on because I want to get nice detailed feathers, and that's going to be impossible to do with a really big brush. So I'm going to be using that tiny brush that we used to actually, you know, apply the solvent to the eye earlier on in part 1. So you can see that when you mix them together, the white powder just dissolves nicely into that liquid, and it does create a really nice paint-like consistency that works really well with the colour pencil. I really like it. The more powder you apply, the more opaque it's going to be, but you don't want to add too much, otherwise it will be really like clogged up and it won't paint really nicely onto the paper. You want it to be able to flow nicely onto the paper. So don't apply too much powder, otherwise it'll just be really thick and it won't work well. If it is too thick, then just add a bit more of the liquid to it. So I'm giving it a good mix, making sure there's no lumps at all. I really want to make everything nice and smooth. So I'm just going to move it over to the side so it's out of the way. I'm just going to start to paint this onto all of the brightest areas. So for example, above the eyes, all of the feathers that I feel need to be brighter and the white coloured pencil just didn't get them bright enough. And this stuff can dry a little more translucent, so it may look really bright when it's applied onto the paper, but then it might dry a little bit less opaque. So just experiment. You may need to go over areas more than once, and this can actually be good if you want a variety. So if you want to mix in a little bit of powder, add a few highlights that aren't as bright, and then mix in a bit more powder to get some even brighter highlights as well. So you have a variety. And really, I'm just going to have fun with this and just paint in some nice highlights, brighten up some of the feathers and add more details. You can see that I'm creating more feathers that are overlapping onto the black feathers to create more of a layered effect. I am looking at the reference to identify the brighter areas, but really you can tell which areas are meant to be the brightest because it's where you've tried to apply a lot of white pencil. So just follow that. Anyway, where you've added a lot of white coloured pencil, just go over it and brighten it up even more with this paintbrush. Or if you're unsure which areas you need to brighten up, then one thing that you can do is take a photo of your drawing as it is and get your reference and compare them, flick between the photos, and it might stand out to you even more which areas aren't bright enough. Another good thing if you're trying to judge values is converting your reference and your drawing into grayscale, into black and white, because it's in like a monochrome, you know, just grey, black to white. It is easier to judge when it's not loads of colours going on, when it's just in one scale of colour. It's easier to judge what areas should be darker and what should be lighter. So still make sure that you're doing all of the things that you did before. Still make sure that you're going with the nice curvature that the feathers are meant to be going in, and adding this brighter layer on top, adding these really bright highlighted feathers does really help to that layered effect. It looks like an extra layer of feathers on top, and so it gives it more depth and gives it more of a realistic feather texture. I'm going to add some feathers over the top of the beak and brighten up that edge of the beak on the right hand side of the beak. Just brighten this area up and just define the edge of the beak a bit more. Then just flicking some of that out to create more of that feather texture. Rather than it being a line, you can see that I just flicked some of it out. So you can see already above the eye where it's dried, it's not as bright as it looked when it was wet. So don't worry if you think it looks crazy bright, it will probably dry a little bit darker and a little bit more translucent than it looks when it's wet. But remember, if you feel like they're not bright enough, then always just add more powder into your mixture and it will make it more opaque. So I will be adding a lot more highlight to the feathers below the eye, and particularly the feathers on this right hand side of the bird. I'm not going to be adding really any highlights throughout the body of the bird because we want that to be nice and shadowed. But most of the highlights are within this fluffy part of the feathers, just under the beak. These areas that I'm working on now, there's quite a lot of highlight there. So that's where I'm going to be applying a lot of this paint for these sections that I'm working on now. Directly below the eye and like to the left of the beak. these larger feathers. But once again, it's always going to be different for your drawing. So your drawing might be slightly different. You might need areas that need to be lighter that I don't need to lighten up more. So just look at your reference and try to evaluate for yourself what is fine, what's bright enough, and what needs to go brighter. Or if you just want to add more texture, then just mix up a very translucent sort of ratio of powder to touch up texture. Apply very little of the powder if you just want to really add a bit of texture. You don't really want to brighten up anything too much. Don't mix in much of the white powder at all, and that will just give you a bit more of a texture without really brightening it up too much. But once again, I'm going to continue now just to go throughout this drawing and just go and add all of these highlights. I'm adding little individual feathers that are going over the top of the black feathers as well to create that layered effect. Keep making sure you clean your brush if it starts to get clogged up, because this stuff can dry very quickly, so your brush may not be as effective after like 10 minutes if it gets a bit clogged up, so you may need to wipe it like I'm doing on just a bit of tissue. So yeah, there's not much else to say about this part, I don't think anyway. I'm just going to repeat this process, and I'll be back to talk you through the next step. I am adding a few highlights around the head of the bird, around the top of the head of the bird, and by the eared feathers. But mainly, most of the highlight was underneath the eyes towards the bottom part of the face and the body, the chest sort of area of the owl. But I will still add a few highlights throughout the top of the head, just to add more variety, and there is a few highlights in those areas. I'm now going back over areas that I've already added some of this to, for areas that I feel once they've dried need to go even brighter. So it's okay to layer this up, which is what I'm doing. So you can see that I am going over areas that I've already applied a layer of this to, and I've mixed in a bit more of the white powder. Well, you don't even need to, you could just go in and add another layer of that same paint and it will brighten it up even more. So it's fine to layer this up, don't feel like you have to get them as bright as they need to be straight away. Sometimes adds more depth if you work on it in this sort of layered way, because you can see that we've got a general base to it where it's a lot brighter now. Then you can go in with another layer to brighten up specific parts to give that feather texture. You can see that I'm able to create more of a feather texture, more detail within each of the feathers with this brighter paint without having to put it everywhere. So it looks like when we can see the base layer peeping through, where we haven't got a second layer on everything, it gives a natural look of shadows, if that makes sense. So yeah, once you've added a base layer of this highlight everywhere, well not everywhere, but over all of the areas that you need to, let everything dry and then evaluate, do you need to add a second layer of this mixture anywhere? Is there anywhere that you need to make even brighter? I'm just adding a few little final highlights, but that is pretty much it for this part. So far we've worked on adding a base layer of coloured pencil to the whole of the owl, establishing the shadows to start off with, then filling in all of the other colours. We've also went through how you can use solvent to blend, so we've got a nice base layer. And now in this part we worked on not only adding details, but how to add second layers to darken up values, and also how to use this mixture, this titanium white powder and touch up texture, to actually go in and paint on some even brighter highlights to really make the whole drawing / painting pop. And in the next part we're going to be finishing this off with a nice blurry soft background, which I'm going to be giving you a few tips and tricks for how you can make it look really soft, particularly by using a tissue. So I'll be showing you what you can do with that to make it really soft, and it's just going to be a nice simple background to go with this, just like the reference. But yeah, I'm just going to spend the next few minutes just finishing this off. It's pretty much done. I'm just again being very picky with how I want it to be. Just keep being observant and looking around the reference and noticing little areas that I want to brighten up even more and add even more detail to. So make sure you take this time to really observe your reference, have a final look around your drawing and see if you're happy with everything. Is everything dark enough? Don't just look at your highlights, look at everything as a whole. Is everything dark enough? Do you need to add any detail anywhere? Because before you move on to the background, just make sure you're happy with every aspect of the owl. Whether that's the highlights, whether that's the shadow, you know, just check everything. But anyway guys, that is it for the second part of this tutorial series. I hope you're enjoying following along with this one, and I'll be back to go through part 3, which is the final part of this tutorial series, where we will be working on the background and finishing this guy off. So I'll see you guys in the final part. Bye everybody.